My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. Revenge isn't what most people think it is. It's not a moment of passion, not a sudden act of violence born from rage. True revenge, the kind that actually matters, the kind that changes everything, is an art form. It requires patience, intelligence, and above all, a deep understanding of human psychology. I've spent my entire career studying the criminal mind. I've interviewed serial killers, analyzed the behavior patterns of sociopaths, and written extensively about the psychology of manipulation. I thought I understood evil, thought I could recognize it from a mile away. I was wrong. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones lurking in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. They're the ones who share your bed, who kiss you goodbye in the morning, who know exactly which buttons to push to make you doubt your own sanity. They're the ones who look like everything you've ever wanted in a partner. This is the story of how I discovered that my husband was one of those predators, and this is the story of how I used everything I knew about the human mind to orchestrate the most elaborate psychological revenge in history. It took me 3 years to plan and execute. By the time my target realized what was happening, it was already too late. By the time he understood the true scope of my revenge, he had lost everything that mattered to him. Some people might say I went too far. Some might argue that what I did was cruel, excessive, even evil. But I want you to judge for yourself. I want you to understand exactly what was done to me, and exactly how I responded. Because the truth is, I'm not sorry, not even a little bit. Let me start at the beginning. 3 years ago, I had what anyone would call a perfect life. I was 34 years old, the head of the criminal psychology department at Stanford University, and one of the youngest tenured professors in the school's history. My research on behavioral analysis and criminal profiling had been published in every major psychology journal. The FBI consulted with me on high-profile cases. I was invited to speak at conferences around the world. But my greatest source of pride wasn't my career, it was my marriage to David Harrison. David was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. He was brilliant, a neurosurgeon at San Francisco General Hospital who specialized in the most complex brain surgeries. He was handsome in that classic way that made other women envious. Tall, dark hair that was just starting to show distinguished gray at the temples, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He was charming, funny, ambitious, and absolutely devoted to me. Or so I thought. We'd met 8 years earlier at a medical conference in Chicago. I was presenting my research on the neurological basis of psychopathic behavior, and David was attending as part of his continuing education requirements. After my presentation, he approached me with thoughtful questions about my work. Genuine intellectual curiosity that was so rare in my personal life. Dr. Vasquez, he said, extending his hand with a smile that made my knees weak. That was fascinating. I've always wondered about the intersection between neurology and criminal behavior. We talked for 3 hours that night, sitting in the hotel bar long after it should have closed, discussing everything from brain imaging techniques to the philosophy of free will. David was one of the few people I'd ever met who could keep up with my intellectual pace, who challenged my ideas without dismissing them, who seemed genuinely fascinated by the workings of my mind. Our courtship was a whirlwind of late-night conversations, weekend trips to conferences where we'd present our respective research, and quiet evenings in his apartment or mine, cooking dinner together and debating the latest developments in our fields. David made me feel like the most interesting person in the world. He proposed on the anniversary of the day we met, in the same hotel bar where we'd first talked. The ring was perfect. A vintage emerald surrounded by diamonds, elegant and unique, nothing like the generic solitaires most of my friends wore. He'd clearly put thought into it, just like he put thought into everything he did for me. Our wedding was small but perfect, held in the garden of a historic inn in Napa Valley. My parents flew in from Mexico City, where my father was a literature professor and my mother was a doctor. David's family came from Boston. Old money, understated elegance, the kind of people who summered in Martha's Vineyard and had been Harvard alumni for generations. I should have paid more attention to how David interacted with my family that weekend. He was charming, of course, but there was something performative about it, like he was playing the role of the perfect son-in-law, rather than genuinely connecting with them. When my mother spoke to me in Spanish, as she often did, David would get this tight smile on his face and ask us to translate, claiming he wanted to learn the language, but never making any real effort to do so. But I was in love. And love makes you blind to red flags that seem obvious in retrospect. For the first 5 years of our marriage, everything seemed perfect. We bought a beautiful house in Palo Alto, a Victorian mansion that David insisted on renovating to his exact specifications. I threw myself into my career while David climbed the ranks at the hospital. We traveled together, entertained colleagues, and talked about starting a family when the time was right. The time became right 2 years ago, when I was 32, and David was 36. We'd been trying for about 6 months when I finally got pregnant. David was ecstatic, or at least he seemed to be. He immediately started planning the nursery, researching the best pediatricians, talking about all the places he wanted to take our child. But looking back now, I can see that's when things started to change. Subtle at first, so subtle that I attributed the changes to normal pregnancy stress and David's increasing responsibilities at the hospital. It started with small things. My car keys would go missing, making me late for important meetings. David would find them later in strange places, the refrigerator, my jewelry box, the bathroom medicine cabinet, and we'd laugh about pregnancy brain making me absent-minded. My research files would disappear from my office, causing panic attacks as I scrambled to meet publication deadlines. They'd always turn up eventually, usually in places where I was certain I hadn't left them. David would comfort me during these episodes, rubbing my back as I cried and apologizing for being so scattered. Dinner reservations would get mysteriously canceled, leaving us standing in restaurants where the hostess insisted we'd never had a reservation in the first place. Important emails would disappear from my computer. My favorite coffee mug would be broken, my reading glasses misplaced, my lecture notes reorganized in ways that made no sense. Each incident was small, explainable, the kind of thing that happens to everyone sometimes, but they were happening to me constantly, and I began to doubt my own competence. Was pregnancy really affecting my memory this severely? Was I losing my ability to function as a professional? David was incredibly supportive during this period. He'd hold me while I cried about my forgetfulness, reassure me that pregnancy brain was completely normal, suggest that maybe I was working too hard and needed to slow down. He was patient and understanding, even when my mistakes affected him too. Like the time I forgot our anniversary dinner reservation at our favorite restaurant and we ended up eating fast food instead. Or when I accidentally threw away the tickets to a medical conference David had been looking forward to for months. He never got angry, never blamed me, just accepted my tearful apologies and told me he loved me no matter what. I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world to have such an understanding husband. I was such a fool. The incidents escalated as my pregnancy progressed. I'd wake up to find my computer files corrupted, my research data seemingly lost forever. I'd arrive at the university to find that my lectures had been canceled due to scheduling conflicts I had no memory of creating. I'd show up for important meetings only to be told that I'd called to reschedule them. My colleagues began to look at me with concern. Dr. Patricia Williams, my longtime mentor and friend, pulled me aside after a particularly embarrassing incident where I'd arrived at a faculty meeting 24 hours late. "Elena, honey, are you okay?" she asked, her weathered face creased with worry. "You seem..." I broke down in her office, sobbing about my failing memory, my inability to keep track of simple things, my fear that pregnancy was somehow damaging my brain. Patricia listened with the patience of a woman who'd mentored dozens of young academics through various crises. "Have you talked to your doctor about this?" she asked. "Severe memory problems aren't typical, even with pregnancy hormones." I had talked to my obstetrician, Dr. Sarah Chen, about my concerns. She'd run tests, checked my hormone levels, and assured me that everything was normal. "Some women do experience more severe cognitive changes during pregnancy," she'd explained. "It's usually temporary and resolves after delivery." But privately, I was terrified. What if it wasn't temporary? What if pregnancy had permanently damaged my ability to think clearly? How could I continue my career if I couldn't trust my own mind? David was my rock during this period. He'd take over tasks that I used to handle easily, paying bills, managing our social calendar, keeping track of important dates. He'd remind me gently when I forgot things, help me search for misplaced items, and never once made me feel stupid or inadequate. "We're a team," he'd say when I apologized for the 100th time. "I've got your back, Elena, always." I was 7 months pregnant when everything changed. It was a Thursday evening in October, unseasonably warm for the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd spent the day at the university, struggling through a lecture where I'd forgotten half my talking points and had to improvise extensively. My students had been polite but clearly confused by my disorganized presentation. I came home exhausted and demoralized, my ankles swollen and my back aching. David had said he'd be working late at the hospital, another emergency surgery that would keep him there until at least midnight. This had become increasingly common over the past few months, but I understood. Brain surgery couldn't be scheduled around convenient office hours. I decided to surprise him with dinner at the hospital. I knew the staff well from various hospital events, and they'd often let me wait in David's office when he was in surgery. I picked up Thai food from his favorite restaurant, the same place we'd ordered from on our first date, and drove to San Francisco General. The hospital parking garage was dimly lit and mostly empty at that hour. I parked near the elevator, gathered the food containers, and started walking toward the hospital entrance. That's when I saw them. David wasn't in surgery. He wasn't even in the hospital. He was in the parking garage, pressed against a black BMW that I didn't recognize, kissing a woman with long black hair and a hospital ID badge clipped to her scrubs. But it wasn't just a kiss, it was intimate, passionate, the kind of embrace that spoke of months or maybe years of familiarity. I stood frozen behind a concrete pillar, the Thai food containers slipping from my numb fingers and crashing to the ground. The sound echoed through the garage, but they were too absorbed in each other to notice. As they broke apart, I got a clear look at the woman's face. Dr. Rebecca Chen, one of the surgical residents. She was beautiful in that effortless way that some women managed: petite, delicate features, perfect skin, probably 10 years younger than me. I'd met her several times at hospital functions, had even complimented David on his mentorship of such a promising young surgeon. "Sarah's getting suspicious," I heard Rebecca say as they stood close together, her hands still resting on David's chest. She asked me about the conference in Chicago again. David's response hit me like a physical blow. "Don't worry about Elena, she's too wrapped up in her research to notice anything. Besides, she's so hormonal and scattered lately, she'd probably blame herself if she found out." They both laughed. Actually laughed about my supposed ignorance, but the worst was yet to come. David pulled out his phone and showed Rebecca something on the screen. I couldn't see what it was from my hiding spot, but Rebecca's reaction was immediate. She gasped, then started laughing again, harder this time. "You actually recorded that?" she asked, her voice filled with incredulous amusement. "Elena's little breakdown last week when she couldn't find her research notes? It was priceless. She was crying and apologizing for being so disorganized. I sent it to Mark and Jeff. They couldn't stop laughing. Jeff said his wife does the same thing when she's PMSing. My research notes, the ones I'd spent 3 days frantically searching for, convinced that I'd somehow lost months of crucial data, the ones that had caused me to have a complete meltdown in our kitchen, sobbing and apologizing to David for being such a mess, for being so forgetful and unreliable. He had hidden them, and filmed my distress, and shared it with his friends for entertainment. The containers of Thai food lay scattered around my feet, pad Thai and green curry soaking into the concrete. I could smell the familiar spices, but they made me nauseous now. Everything made me nauseous. I backed away as quietly as I could, my pregnant belly making stealth difficult. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my car keys out of my purse. I sat in my car for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching David and Rebecca through the windshield as they talked and laughed and touched each other with the casual intimacy of longtime lovers. Finally, they separated. Rebecca got into the BMW and drove away. David checked his watch, straightened his clothes, and walked toward the hospital entrance. He was going inside to establish his alibi, to create evidence that he'd been working late. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd witnessed. How long had this been going on? How many of David's emergency surgeries had actually been meetings with Rebecca? How many of my perceived failures and embarrassments had actually been his deliberate sabotage? I sat in our driveway for 2 hours, unable to bring myself to go inside. The house that had once represented everything I'd achieved, professional success, personal happiness, financial security, now felt like a stage set for David's elaborate deception. When I finally went inside, I walked through our home like a stranger, seeing everything with new eyes. The family photos that showed our seemingly perfect life, the expensive furniture that David had insisted on buying, the nursery we decorated together for our unborn child. All of it was built on lies. I went to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo on David's nightstand. It was from our honeymoon in Italy, both of us laughing as we tried to take a selfie in front of the Trevi fountain. I looked so happy in that picture, so completely trusting and in love. That woman seemed like a stranger to me now. David came home around midnight, just as he'd predicted. He was carrying flowers, white roses, my favorites, and wearing the slightly tired but satisfied expression of a surgeon who'd successfully completed a difficult procedure. "Sorry I'm so late, sweetheart," he said, kissing my forehead as I pretended to be half asleep. "Emergency craniotomy that went longer than expected. How was your day?" I mumbled something about being tired and feeling the baby kick. David rubbed my belly gently, talking softly to our unborn daughter about how much he loved her already, how he couldn't wait to meet her. The performance was flawless. If I hadn't seen him with Rebecca just hours earlier, I would have believed every word, but I had seen him, and now I knew the truth. David Harrison, my brilliant, charming, devoted husband, was a sociopathic manipulator who had been systematically destroying my confidence and sanity for months. He was cheating on me with a younger woman, laughing about my pain with his friends, and treating my pregnancy like an inconvenience to be managed. As I lay there in the dark, listening to David's steady breathing beside me, feeling our daughter moving restlessly in my womb, I made a decision that would change everything. David wanted to play mind games, fine, but he had no idea who he was playing with. I was Dr. Elena Vasquez. I had spent 15 years studying the criminal mind, understanding how predators think, how they manipulate, how they destroy their victims. I had consulted on cases involving the most sophisticated psychological manipulators in the country. I had written papers on gaslighting, emotional abuse, and the systematic destruction of victims' reality. David thought he was clever. He thought he'd found the perfect victim, a pregnant woman too distracted and emotional to see what was happening to her. But he'd just declared war on the wrong person, and I was going to destroy him. The next 3 months were the most challenging period of my life. I had to pretend that nothing had changed while simultaneously conducting the most important research project of my career, a comprehensive psychological profile of my own husband. David continued his pattern of working late several nights a week, which I now knew meant he was with Rebecca. He maintained his facade of the concerned, supportive husband, helping me through my continued forgetfulness and pregnancy brain episodes. He even increased his sabotage, perhaps emboldened by how completely I seemed to be falling apart. But I wasn't falling apart anymore. I was watching, learning, documenting everything. The beautiful thing about being a forensic psychologist is that you learn to observe human behavior with scientific detachment. You can separate emotion from analysis, personal feelings from professional assessment. It's a skill that had served me well in my research, and now I was applying it to the most important case of my life. I began by creating a comprehensive behavioral profile of David, using hidden cameras that I installed throughout our house, tiny devices I purchased online with untraceable cash. I started documenting his behavior when he thought no one was watching. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined. David wasn't just unfaithful, he was a textbook narcissistic sociopath with strong manipulative tendencies. When he thought I couldn't see him, his mask would slip completely. I watched him practice expressions in the mirror, rehearsing the concerned look he'd give me when I discovered something he'd hidden. I saw him laugh while reading my frantic emails about missing files. I watched him deliberately move my things, then return to help me find them with perfectly feigned confusion. Most disturbing of all, he was documenting his manipulation. I discovered that David had been keeping detailed records of his psychological warfare against me. Hidden on his laptop, encrypted and password protected, was a folder labeled Elena Project that contained videos, photos, and written observations of my reactions to his sabotage. The files were organized by date and included David's commentary. March 15th, Hitty's car keys in garage toolbox, took her 45 minutes to find them, missed important department meeting, cried for 20 minutes, apologized repeatedly for being so scattered. Video attached. April 3rd, deleted draft of E's journal article from her computer. She spent 3 hours trying to recover it before calling me in tears. I found the backup copy I'd made beforehand. She was so grateful she made my favorite dinner. Hilarious how easy this is. May 20th, canceled E's reservation at Giovanni's and told hostess she'd changed her mind. E completely mortified when we arrived for her birthday dinner. She actually apologized to Emmy for forgetting to confirm. Rebecca thinks this is the funniest thing she's ever heard. There were dozens of these entries, each documenting a deliberate act of psychological torture, each accompanied by David's amused observations about my reactions. He was treating my mental anguish like a science experiment, and he was enjoying every minute of it. But the most revealing files were the ones where David analyzed my behavior patterns and discussed his long-term strategy with Rebecca. They communicated through an encrypted messaging app, planning their manipulation like generals planning a military campaign. Elaine is starting to doubt her professional competence. David had written to Rebecca, "I think we can push this further. If I can make her feel incompetent enough, she might take extended maternity leave, maybe even step back from her career entirely, would solve the two-career household problem nicely." Rebecca's response was equally chilling. "You're so bad, but brilliant. She's lucky to have such a supportive husband helping her through her difficulties." They had a long-term plan. David wasn't just cheating, he was systematically destroying my career and self-confidence so that I would become completely dependent on him. He wanted me to retreat from my professional life, to become the perfect housewife who would never question his absences or discover his infidelity. The pregnancy wasn't an inconvenience to his plans, it was central to them. A new mother, isolated from her career, dependent on her husband for financial and emotional support, struggling with postpartum hormones and self-doubt, would be the perfect victim for continued manipulation. David had been playing the long game all along, but he'd made one crucial mistake: he'd chosen the wrong target. I spent weeks studying David's patterns, learning his schedule, understanding his psychology. I accessed his email accounts, his phone records, his financial information. I mapped out his relationship with Rebecca, documenting their meetings, their communications, their future plans. I discovered that they'd been having an affair for over a year, starting just a few months after I'd gotten pregnant. David had actually met Rebecca at a medical conference, the same kind of conference where he and I had met 8 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their relationship followed a predictable pattern. David was the sophisticated older mentor. Rebecca was the eager young protege. He'd seduced her with intellectual conversations and promises of advancing her career. He'd painted me as the demanding, high-maintenance wife who didn't understand the pressures of his work. But I also discovered something that David didn't know. Rebecca was playing her own game. While she seemed completely devoted to David, she was also involved with Dr. Michael Torres, another attending physician at the hospital. Rebecca was hedging her bets, keeping her options open, manipulating multiple relationships simultaneously. This gave me an idea. If David wanted to play psychological games, I would give him exactly what he deserved. But I wouldn't just expose his affair or humiliate him publicly. That would be too quick, too merciful. David had spent months slowly destroying my sanity, my confidence, my sense of reality. He deserved to experience the same gradual psychological torture. I began planning his destruction with the same methodical precision that I applied to my academic research. I created timelines, identified targets, developed contingency plans. I studied every case I'd ever worked on involving psychological manipulation and adapted those techniques for my own purposes. David thought he understood psychology because he could manipulate one pregnant woman. But he was about to learn the difference between amateur hour and professional-level psychological warfare. The first phase of my plan was subtle misdirection. I needed David to believe that his manipulation was working perfectly, while I gathered more intelligence and prepared for escalation. I began playing the role of the increasingly unstable pregnant woman. I made sure David found me crying over missing files that I'd actually hidden myself. I apologized repeatedly for mistakes that I deliberately created. I expressed gratitude for his patience and support, making him feel secure in his superiority. "I don't know what I'd do without you," I told him one evening, clinging to his arm as I pretended to be overwhelmed by a minor setback at work. "I feel like I'm losing my mind lately. Thank God I have you to keep me grounded." David's smile in response was genuinely pleased. He was enjoying my performance, never suspecting that it was exactly that, a performance designed to make him overconfident and careless. While I played the role of victim, I was busy gathering ammunition for the war to come. I documented everything. David's lies, his meeting with Rebecca, his psychological manipulation tactics, his hidden files, his financial irregularities. I created backup copies of all evidence and stored them in multiple secure locations. I also began researching David's vulnerabilities. What were his greatest fears, his deepest insecurities, his most precious possessions? What would hurt him the most if he lost it? The answer was obvious: his career. David's identity was entirely wrapped up in being a brilliant neurosurgeon. He lived for the respect of his colleagues, the admiration of his patients, the prestige that came with his position. His self-worth was completely dependent on his professional success. That's where I would hit him. Not with a single devastating blow, but with a campaign of small incidents that would gradually undermine his confidence, his reputation, and his sanity. I would do to David exactly what he had done to me, slowly, systematically, with perfect deniability. And unlike David, I wouldn't just document his suffering for my own amusement. I would make sure he understood exactly what was happening to him, and why. The game was about to begin. I gave birth to Emma on December 15th, a snowy Tuesday morning that should have been one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, it marked the beginning of David's psychological destruction. The labor was long and difficult, 18 hours of pain that David documented extensively on his phone, claiming he wanted to capture every moment of our daughter's arrival. But I caught him showing some of the more unflattering videos to the medical staff, laughing about how crazy I looked during contractions. Even in the delivery room, he couldn't resist turning my pain into entertainment. Emma was perfect, 7 pounds, 2 ounces of pure perfection with David's dark hair and my brown eyes. When the nurse placed her in my arms for the first time, I felt a surge of protective love so fierce it took my breath away. This beautiful, innocent child was depending on me to protect her from the monster she called Daddy. David played the role of devoted father flawlessly. He posted photos on social media, sent announcements to colleagues, and accepted congratulations with the perfect mixture of joy and exhaustion. He took paternity leave, 2 weeks that he spent mostly at the hospital, claiming he needed to check on patients but actually meeting with Rebecca. During those 2 weeks, while I was home with a newborn recovering from childbirth and dealing with postpartum hormones, David escalated his psychological warfare. He would accidentally wake Emma during her naps, then express confusion when I couldn't get her back to sleep. He would hide baby supplies, then find them in impossible places and suggest that my mommy brain was worse than my pregnancy brain had been. "Maybe you should write things down," he suggested gently after I spent 20 minutes looking for Emma's favorite pacifier, which he had hidden in the freezer. New mom stress can really affect your memory, but I was ready for him now. Every incident was expected, documented, and carefully analyzed. I had cameras hidden throughout the house, recording David's deliberate sabotage and his barely concealed amusement at my distress. More importantly, I had begun phase 1 of my counterattack. David was obsessively organized, a trait that served him well in surgery but made him vulnerable to precisely the kind of manipulation he'd been inflicting on me. His morning routine was invariable: shower at 5:30 a.m., coffee at 6, check emails while eating breakfast, leave for the hospital at 6:45 exactly. I began with tiny disruptions. His coffee mug would be in the dishwasher instead of the cabinet. His favorite pen would be in the wrong drawer. His car keys would be moved from the hook by the door to the kitchen counter. At first he didn't even notice. When he did, he assumed he'd made the mistakes himself, but as the incidents multiplied, I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. "Have you seen my reading glasses?" he asked one morning, patting his pockets and looking around the kitchen. "They're on your head, honey," I replied, bouncing Emma gently as she fussed. David reached up and found his glasses exactly where I'd said they'd be. He laughed, but it sounded forced. "I could have sworn I put them on the nightstand last night." "You've been working so hard," I said sympathetically. "Maybe you should get more sleep." The beauty of gaslighting is that it works slowly, imperceptibly. David had spent months making me doubt my own perceptions, and now I was returning the favor. But I had advantages he'd never had. I understood the psychology behind the manipulation, and I had access to all his devices and accounts. I began the second phase of my plan by targeting David's professional life. Using his hospital login credentials, which I'd obtained by installing keylogger software on his laptop, I started making subtle changes to his schedule and patient files. Nothing dangerous. I would never risk harming a patient, but I would add fake meetings to his calendar, then delete them at the last minute. I would change the location of conferences he was supposed to attend. I would modify minor details in his surgical notes, making him question his own memory of procedures. Dr. Harrison, his surgical coordinator Janet, called one Tuesday morning while David was having breakfast. "You missed the pre-op meeting for Mrs. Rodriguez. The family was expecting to speak with you before surgery." David went pale. "What pre-op meeting? Her surgery isn't until Thursday." "According to your calendar, the meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. today," Janet said patiently. "Should I reschedule?" David pulled up his calendar on his phone, confusion evident on his face. "I don't understand. I never scheduled a meeting for today. Mrs. Rodriguez's surgery is Thursday at 10 a.m. "That's what I have too," Janet agreed. "But your calendar definitely shows the meeting for this morning." Maybe there was a glitch in the system. After he hung up, David stared at his phone for several minutes, scrolling through his calendar entries. I watched him from across the kitchen, feeding Emma her bottle and making sympathetic noises. "Technical problems?" I asked. "I guess so," David muttered. "The hospital scheduling system has been acting up lately." It wasn't the hospital system that was acting up. It was me, systematically undermining David's confidence in his own organizational abilities. Over the next several weeks, the incidents escalated. David would arrive at surgeries to find that his preferred instruments hadn't been sterilized because the request had mysteriously disappeared from the system. He would show up for important meetings that had been rescheduled without his knowledge. He would prepare presentations for conferences that turned out to be on completely different topics than what he'd been told. His colleagues began to notice. Dr. Patricia Morgan, the chief of surgery, pulled David aside after he arrived 2 hours late for a department meeting. "David, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice concerned but professional. "You seem distracted lately. Maybe you need more time to adjust to being a new father?" David's jaw tightened. Being questioned about his competence was his worst nightmare. "Everything's fine, Patricia. Just some scheduling mix-ups with the new computer system." "Of course," Dr. Morgan agreed. "But if you need support, don't hesitate to ask. We all know how demanding it can be to balance family and career." When David came home that evening, he was agitated in a way I'd never seen before. He paced the living room while I nursed Emma, running his hands through his hair and muttering about incompetent administrators and faulty computer systems. "Bad day?" I asked, though I already knew exactly how bad it had been. "The hospital scheduling system is completely screwed up," David said, pouring himself a large glass of wine. "I've had 3 meetings rescheduled without notification, 2 surgical prep sessions that apparently never existed, and now Patricia thinks I'm losing my edge because I can't keep track of my own calendar." I made appropriately sympathetic noises while inwardly celebrating. David was beginning to experience the same confusion and self-doubt that he'd deliberately inflicted on me, but this was just the beginning. "Maybe you should start keeping a backup calendar," I suggested. "You know, write things down by hand as well as putting them in the computer?" David looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. "That's actually a good idea. I've been relying too much on technology lately." He started carrying a leather-bound planner everywhere, meticulously writing down every appointment, every surgery, every meeting. It made him feel more in control, more organized, more like his old self, which is exactly why I targeted it next. I had access to David's planner every night when he was sleeping. It was simple to make small changes, altering times, modifying locations, adding appointments that didn't exist. I practiced his handwriting until I could replicate it perfectly, then began adding confusing entries that David would find and not remember writing. Meeting with Dr. Chen. Discuss Elena's situation. 3 p.m. Thursday appeared in David's planner one Wednesday morning. David stared at the entry for several minutes, having no memory of writing it and no idea what Elena's situation it could be referring to. He called Rebecca to ask about the meeting. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, sounding annoyed. "I never scheduled any meeting with you. And what Elena's situation?" David hung up feeling more confused than ever. Was he losing his mind? How could he have written something in his own handwriting that he had no memory of writing? Meanwhile, I was working on the third phase of my plan, destroying David's relationship with Rebecca. I had been monitoring their communications since discovering the affair, so I knew all their patterns, their inside jokes, their future plans. I used this knowledge to create doubt and suspicion between them. I started by creating fake social media profiles and began flirting with Rebecca online. I sent her flowers at the hospital from a secret admirer. I left romantic voicemails on her phone that would hang up when she answered. Rebecca naturally told David about these mysterious romantic advances. David's response was exactly what I'd predicted: jealousy, suspicion, and paranoia. "Who do you think it is?" he demanded during one of their phone conversations, which I was recording through the spy software I'd installed on his phone. "I have no idea," Rebecca replied. "The flowers didn't have a card, and the phone calls just hang up. It's kind of creepy, actually." "Have you been seeing anyone else?" David asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "David, I can't believe you just asked me that. Of course I haven't been seeing anyone else. I'm with you." But I could hear the doubt in Rebecca's voice too. David's increasing paranoia and possessiveness were making their relationship less fun, less exciting. The confident, successful surgeon she'd fallen for was being replaced by an insecure, suspicious man who questioned her loyalty and checked her phone when he thought she wasn't looking. I escalated the psychological pressure on both of them. I sent Rebecca anonymous emails claiming that David was married and using her, complete with photos of our wedding and family life that I'd pulled from social media. I sent David anonymous messages suggesting that Rebecca was laughing about him behind his back, sharing intimate details of their relationship with other residents. Neither of these messages was entirely false, which made them particularly effective. David was married and was using Rebecca. Rebecca did share details about their relationship with others. I'd seen the group chats where she and other residents gossiped about the attendings they were sleeping with. The paranoia began eating away at both of them. David became increasingly possessive and controlling, demanding to know where Rebecca was every moment of the day. Rebecca became defensive and resentful, tired of being treated like a cheating girlfriend when she was risking her career for their relationship. Their fights became legendary among the hospital staff. Nurses would gossip about the raised voices coming from supply closets. Other residents began avoiding Rebecca, not wanting to be associated with the drama surrounding her affair with Dr. Harrison. But I wasn't satisfied with just destroying David's relationship. I wanted him to experience the complete erosion of reality that he'd inflicted on me. Phase 4 involved targeting David's sense of identity and competence. I began manipulating his surgical schedule, his patient files, and his research data. Nothing that would harm patients. I maintained strict ethical boundaries, but enough to make David question his own abilities. I would change the settings on his preferred surgical instruments so that they felt different in his hands. I would modify his research spreadsheets so that his calculations wouldn't add up correctly. I would alter the fonts and formatting in documents he was preparing for publication, making them look unprofessional and sloppy. Most importantly, I began documenting David's growing confusion and paranoia, just as he had documented mine. But unlike David, who had shared my humiliation with his friends for entertainment, I was building a legal case. Every instance of David's erratic behavior was carefully recorded and cataloged. His increasing outbursts at work, his accusations against innocent colleagues, his paranoid theories about hospital conspiracies, all of it was documented with timestamps and context. I also began confiding in people about my concerns regarding David's mental health. I spoke to our neighbors, our mutual friends, even some of David's colleagues, expressing worry about his increasingly erratic behavior. "I'm so concerned about David," I told Dr. Sarah Kim, one of David's surgical colleagues, during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "He's been so forgetful lately, and yesterday I found him in Emma's nursery at 3 a.m., just standing there staring at the wall. When I asked what he was doing, he seemed confused about how he'd gotten there. Of course, this incident had never happened, but Dr. Kim didn't know that. She filed it away as another concerning data point about David's deteriorating mental state. "New fatherhood can be overwhelming," Dr. Kim said sympathetically. "Has he considered talking to someone? The hospital has an excellent employee assistance program." "I've suggested it," I replied, managing to look both worried and supportive. "But you know how doctors are about admitting they need help." These conversations served multiple purposes. They established my credibility as the concerned, long-suffering wife. They created a network of witnesses who would testify to David's declining mental state. And they planted seeds of doubt about David's competence among his professional colleagues. Within 6 months of Emma's birth, David's reputation at the hospital was in serious decline. He'd missed important meetings, showed up unprepared for surgeries, and had several public outbursts that concerned his colleagues.
Rumors were circulating about his mental stability, his relationship with Rebecca, and his fitness to practice medicine. Dr. Patricia Morgan called David into her office on a Thursday morning in June. I knew about the meeting because I'd seen it in David's calendar, which I monitored constantly. "David, we need to talk," Dr. Morgan said, closing her office door behind him. "I've been getting complaints about your behavior lately. Missed meetings, preparation issues, and several nurses have reported that you've been difficult to work with." David's hands were shaking as he sat down across from her desk. "Patricia, I can explain. I'm not looking for explanations," Dr. Morgan interrupted. "I'm looking for solutions. You're one of our best surgeons, David, but lately your performance has been inconsistent. I'm concerned about you, both personally and professionally." "It's just stress," David said desperately. "New baby, you know how it is. I'm adjusting. It's been 6 months, David. How much longer do you need to adjust?" Dr. Morgan's voice was firm but not unkind. "I'm recommending that you take a leave of absence. Get some rest, spend time with your family, maybe talk to someone about managing stress. A leave of absence." David's voice rose in panic. "Patricia, you can't be serious. I don't need a leave of absence. I need people to stop sabotaging my schedule and messing with my files." Dr. Morgan's expression grew concerned. "David, no one is sabotaging you. The incidents you're referring to have all been investigated. They're mostly simple human errors or computer glitches. Computer glitches don't explain how my surgical notes keep getting changed," David insisted. "Someone is deliberately trying to make me look incompetent." "David, listen to yourself. You're talking about conspiracies, about people targeting you specifically. That's not rational thinking." David left Dr. Morgan's office in a rage, convinced that everyone at the hospital was against him. He came home that afternoon looking like a broken man, his confidence shattered, his professional identity in ruins. I found him in his study, staring at the wall, his hands trembling as he held a glass of whiskey. "Bad day?" I asked, though I already knew exactly how bad it had been. "They want me to take a leave of absence," David said quietly. "Patricia thinks I'm having a breakdown." I sat down beside him, taking his free hand in mine. "Maybe that's not such a bad idea. You have been under a lot of stress lately." "I'm not having a breakdown," David snapped. "Someone is doing this to me, Elena. Someone is deliberately sabotaging my career, and no one believes me." "Who would do that?" I asked gently. "And why?"
David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with paranoid thoughts he couldn't quite voice. Was it Rebecca? A jealous colleague? A disgruntled patient's family member? He couldn't know that the person destroying his life was sitting right beside him, holding his hand, and looking at him with perfect sympathy. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but I'm going to find out." David's forced leave of absence began the following Monday. For the first time in his adult life, he had nowhere to go, nothing to do, no identity to maintain. He was just a man sitting in his expensive house, slowly losing his mind. I watched his deterioration with the clinical detachment I'd perfected over years of studying criminal behavior. David was exhibiting all the classic signs of someone whose reality was being systematically undermined: paranoia, confusion, desperate attempts to regain control, and increasing social isolation. But unlike my previous research subjects, David was my target, not my patient. I felt no obligation to help him understand what was happening, or to provide therapeutic intervention. He was getting exactly what he deserved. Without the structure of his hospital routine, David became obsessed with trying to solve the mystery of his sabotage. He spent hours reviewing his calendar entries, trying to figure out how meetings had been changed without his knowledge. He installed security software on his computer, convinced that someone was hacking his files. He even hired a private investigator to look into his colleagues, searching for evidence of a conspiracy against him. The private investigator, a former police detective named Mike Torres, was thorough but ultimately useless. He found no evidence of any conspiracy because of course there wasn't one. There was just me, methodically destroying David's life from the inside. "Mr. Harrison," Mike reported after 2 weeks of investigation, "I've reviewed all your hospital communications, interviewed several of your colleagues, and analyzed your computer systems. I found no evidence that anyone is deliberately sabotaging your career." "That's impossible," David insisted. "Someone is doing this to me. Sometimes when we're under extreme stress, sir, we can start seeing patterns that aren't really there. Have you considered talking to a mental health professional?" David fired Mike that same day. Meanwhile, David's relationship with Rebecca had reached its breaking point. The paranoia, the accusations, the constant surveillance had destroyed whatever attraction she'd once felt for him. She was also worried about her own career. Being associated with David's increasingly erratic behavior was damaging her reputation among the hospital staff. I listened to their final breakup conversation through the recording devices I'd planted in David's car. It was a masterpiece of mutual destruction. "I can't do this anymore, David," Rebecca said, her voice tired and strained. "You're not the man I fell in love with. You're paranoid, controlling, and frankly, you're scaring me." "Scaring you?" David's voice was incredulous. "I'm trying to protect our relationship. Someone is targeting me, trying to destroy my career, and you're acting like it's all in my head. Maybe it is in your head, Rebecca shot back. Maybe you're having some kind of breakdown and you're too proud to admit it. You don't believe me either, David said, and I could hear the devastation in his voice. After everything we've been through, you think I'm crazy. I think you need help, Rebecca replied. Professional help. And I think our relationship has become toxic for both of us. So that's it. You're just going to abandon me when I need you most? I'm not abandoning you, David. I'm protecting myself. And honestly, you should be more worried about your wife finding out about us than about imaginary conspiracies. That conversation ended their affair, but it did something even more valuable for me. It gave David a new target for his paranoia. If Rebecca thought he was crazy, if she was abandoning him, maybe she was part of the conspiracy against him. Maybe she'd been working against him all along. David began investigating Rebecca with the same obsessive intensity he'd applied to his other colleagues. He followed her after work, monitored her social media, and even broke into her apartment while she was at the hospital. He found exactly what I'd planted for him to find: evidence of Rebecca's relationship with Dr. Michael Torres, the other attending physician she'd been seeing simultaneously. Photos of them together, romantic text messages, even hotel receipts from their weekend getaways. The discovery destroyed David completely. Not only had Rebecca been cheating on him, but she'd been doing it for months, probably laughing about him with her other lover, just as she'd laughed about me. David came home that night looking like a ghost. He'd been drinking. I could smell the alcohol on him from across the room, and his hands were shaking as he tried to pour himself another whiskey. She was cheating on me, he said without preamble. Rebecca, she was seeing someone else the whole time. I looked up from the baby formula I was preparing, feigning surprise. What are you talking about? Rebecca Chen, the surgical resident. David's voice was hollow, defeated. We were involved, and she was cheating on me with another doctor. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. David's confession, recorded on the hidden cameras throughout our house, admitting to his affair with complete spontaneity. You were having an affair? I asked, my voice carefully calibrated to sound shocked and hurt. Yes, David whispered. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry. I know how this sounds, especially with everything else that's been happening, but I need you to know that she was lying to me too. I set down the baby bottle and turned to face him fully. How long? About a year, David admitted. It started when you were pregnant. I know that makes it worse, but a year, I interrupted, allowing my voice to break slightly. David, I was pregnant. I was carrying your child, and you were cheating on me. I know, he said, tears streaming down his face. I know how horrible that is, but Elena, she was playing me the whole time. She was using me, just like everyone else is using me. I stared at him, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet and controlled. Get out. Elena, please, get out of this house. Tonight, I need time to think, and I can't do that with you here. David packed a bag and left that same evening, moving into a hotel downtown. I called my lawyer the next morning and filed for divorce, citing adultery and emotional abuse. I also called Dr. Martin Reeves, a psychiatrist I'd worked with on several criminal cases. I need to ask a favor, Martin, I said during our phone conversation. My husband has been having some kind of mental breakdown, and I'm concerned about his fitness to parent our daughter. Reeves was sympathetic and professional. What kind of symptoms are you observing? Paranoid delusions, claims that colleagues are sabotaging his career, erratic behavior, inability to maintain professional relationships. He's been placed on leave from the hospital. Has he shown any signs of violence or aggression? Not yet, but I'm worried. He's become obsessed with conspiracy theories, and yesterday he admitted to stalking a female colleague. I have recordings of him making threats. This wasn't entirely true. David had never explicitly threatened anyone, but his increasingly erratic behavior could certainly be interpreted as threatening, especially when viewed through the lens of his affair and stalking activities. I'd like to schedule an evaluation, Dr. Reeves said. The sooner the better, given your concerns about your daughter's safety. David was reluctant to attend the psychiatric evaluation, but his lawyer advised him that refusing would look bad in the divorce proceedings. He showed up to Dr. Reeves' office looking haggard and desperate, having barely slept in days. The evaluation was everything I'd hoped for. David, sleep-deprived and paranoid, performed poorly on cognitive tests. He became agitated when Dr. Reeves questioned his perception of recent events. He insisted that someone was sabotaging him, that his wife was the only person he could trust, that there was a vast conspiracy to destroy his career. Can you tell me about this conspiracy, David? Dr. Reeves asked gently. Someone's been changing my files, altering my calendar, making me look incompetent, David explained, his voice gaining intensity. They've turned my colleagues against me, convinced them that I'm losing my mind. Who is they? I don't know exactly. Maybe someone at the hospital who's jealous of my success. Maybe Rebecca, my former colleague. She might be trying to destroy me because our relationship ended badly. David, I've reviewed your hospital records. The incidents you're describing have all been investigated by hospital administration. They found no evidence of deliberate sabotage. Of course they didn't, David snapped. Whoever's doing this is too smart to leave obvious evidence, but I know what's happening to me. I'm not crazy. Dr. Reeves made careful notes throughout the session. David's insistence on his own rationality, combined with his paranoid theories and documented erratic behavior, painted a clear picture of someone experiencing a significant psychological crisis. David, I'm going to recommend that you undergo immediate psychiatric treatment, Dr. Reeves concluded. I believe you're experiencing acute stress reaction with paranoid features. With proper treatment, this condition can be managed effectively. I don't need treatment, David protested. I need someone to believe me and help me find out who's doing this to me. David, the most helpful thing you can do right now is accept that you're struggling and get the support you need. Dr. Reeves' report was devastating for David's case. The psychiatrist diagnosed him with acute stress reaction with paranoid features, recommended immediate treatment, and suggested that he might be unfit to have unsupervised custody of Emma until his condition improved. The family court judge agreed. David was granted only supervised visitation with our daughter, and only after completing a psychiatric evaluation and beginning treatment, but I still wasn't finished with him. 6 months later, David looked like a shell of his former self. The psychiatric treatment had helped with some of his more obvious symptoms, but he was still convinced that someone had deliberately destroyed his life. He just couldn't prove it. He was living in a small apartment, working part-time as a medical consultant, and seeing Emma twice a week under court-ordered supervision. His medical license was under review by the state board. His reputation was in ruins, and his former colleagues avoided him at professional events. Most importantly, he still had no idea what had really happened to him. I decided it was time for the final act of my revenge. David needed to understand exactly what had been done to him and why. He needed to know that his suffering wasn't random, wasn't the result of stress or mental illness, but was justice, carefully planned and meticulously executed. I invited him to our house on a rainy Saturday evening in November, exactly 2 years after I discovered his affair. Emma was staying with my parents for the weekend, giving us privacy for what I knew would be our final conversation as husband and wife. David arrived looking nervous and hopeful. He'd been working with his therapist on rebuilding trust and probably thought this dinner invitation meant I was considering reconciliation. I served his favorite meal, the same lamb dish I'd made for our first anniversary, and opened a bottle of wine that we'd been saving for a special occasion. David relaxed as the evening progressed, talking cautiously about his therapy, his new job prospects, his hopes for increased custody of Emma. I know I made terrible mistakes, Elena, he said as we finished dinner. The affair was inexcusable, and I know I hurt you deeply, but I want you to know that I'm committed to becoming a better person, a better father. I appreciate that, David, I replied, and I think it's time we were completely honest with each other. I stood up and walked to the living room, returning with a laptop that I set on the dining room table between us. Before we talk about the future, I think you need to understand what really happened to your career, your relationship with Rebecca, and your mental health over the past 2 years. David looked confused. What do you mean? I opened the laptop and pulled up a folder labeled David's Education. It contained hundreds of files, videos, photos, audio recordings, documents, and detailed timelines. I know about Rebecca, I said quietly. I've known since October 15, 2021, when I saw you with her in the hospital parking garage. David's face went white. Elena, I also know about the videos you took of me, I continued, clicking on a subfolder. The ones where you documented my breakdowns and shared them with your friends for entertainment. I turned the laptop screen toward him, showing him his own files, the Elena Project folder that he thought was securely hidden on his computer. David stared at the screen in shock. How did you get these? The same way I got access to everything else in your life over the past 2 years. You see, David, you made a crucial mistake when you decided to play psychological games with me. You underestimated your opponent. I clicked on another folder, this one containing security camera footage from our house. David watched himself hiding my car keys, moving my research files, and practicing concerned expressions in the mirror. You wanted to make me doubt my own sanity, I said conversationally. You succeeded for a while, but then I realized something important. I'm not your victim. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I'm a forensic psychologist who specializes in criminal manipulation. I've spent 15 years studying people exactly like you. David was shaking now, his wine glass forgotten as he stared at the evidence of his own cruelty displayed on the laptop screen. The missing files, the changed appointments, the computer glitches at the hospital, I continued. That was all me, David. I did to you exactly what you did to me, except I did it better. I showed him more files, screenshots of his altered calendar entries, copies of the fake emails I'd sent to Rebecca, records of every small change I'd made to his professional life. Rebecca's mysterious admirer, that was me. The anonymous emails telling her about your marriage, also me. The evidence she found of your harassment, that convinced her to end your relationship, all me. David tried to speak, but no words came out. He was staring at 2 years of his life, seeing it completely recontextualized, understanding for the first time that every moment of confusion, every professional humiliation, every personal betrayal had been orchestrated by the woman sitting across from him. The private investigator found nothing, because there was no conspiracy, I explained. Just me, using your own tactics against you with scientific precision. You taught me how effective psychological manipulation could be, David. You were an excellent teacher. I pulled up the audio files from David's therapy sessions, which I'd been recording through the keylogger software on his phone. Even your psychiatric diagnosis was real, I said. You really were experiencing paranoid delusions and acute stress. The only difference is that I was the one causing that stress, not some mysterious conspiracy. David finally found his voice. You destroyed my career, my reputation, my relationship with my daughter. I gave you consequences, I corrected. For the first time in your life, you experienced real consequences for your actions. You psychologically tortured a pregnant woman for entertainment, David. You systematically destroyed my confidence and self-worth while I was carrying your child. You turned my pain into a game that you played with your friends. I showed him the videos he'd taken of me, crying over missing research files, apologizing for mistakes I hadn't made, frantically searching for things he'd hidden. Look at these videos, David. Really look at them. Look at the woman who trusted you completely, who apologized for your cruelty, who blamed herself for your deliberate sabotage. That woman was carrying your daughter. She was vulnerable and scared, and trying her best to be a good wife and mother. David was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he watched his own documentation of my suffering. You enjoyed this, I said relentlessly. You laughed about it with your friends. You shared these moments of genuine anguish because you found them amusing. You turned the woman who loved you into entertainment. Elena, please, David whispered. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't heal the psychological damage you inflicted, I replied. Sorry doesn't restore the months of my life you stole from me. Sorry doesn't undo the trauma you caused while I was pregnant with your child. I closed the laptop and looked at him directly. But justice does provide a certain satisfaction. You wanted to see what it looked like when someone slowly lost their grip on reality. Well, David, you got a front row seat to your own psychological destruction. How did it feel? David was sobbing openly now, his hands shaking as the full scope of my revenge became clear to him. What happens now, he asked. Now you live with the consequences of your choices, I said simply. Your career is ruined because you chose to abuse your position of power. Your relationship with Rebecca was destroyed because you chose to be unfaithful. Your custody of Emma is limited because you chose to prioritize your own entertainment over your family's well-being. I stood up and began clearing the dinner dishes. The divorce will be finalized next month. You'll see Emma twice a week as the court ordered. You'll continue your psychiatric treatment, which you actually do need after what you put yourself through, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that every moment of suffering you experienced was justice for what you did to me. David sat at the table for a long time after I'd finished cleaning up, staring at nothing, processing the complete destruction of his understanding of the past 2 years. Finally, he looked up at me. Are you going to tell the psychiatrist? The court? Are you going to explain what really happened? I considered his question seriously. No, I said finally. Your mental health problems were real, even if I was the cause. Your paranoia and stress were genuine responses to the psychological pressure I applied. The fact that your suffering was deliberate rather than random doesn't make your symptoms any less real. But you could clear my name. You could restore my career. Why would I do that? I asked. You never gave me that courtesy when you were destroying my sense of reality. You never offered me the truth when I was crying and apologizing for things that weren't my fault. David had no response to that. The beautiful thing about perfect revenge, I continued, is that it's self-sustaining. Even now that you know the truth, who would believe you? You're a diagnosed psychiatric patient claiming that your ex-wife orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy against you. Even your own therapist would see that as a continuation of your paranoid delusions. I was right, and David knew it. The truth was so outrageous, so elaborate, that it sounded exactly like the kind of conspiracy theory that a mentally ill person would concoct. Besides, I added, you got exactly what you deserved. You're a psychological predator who enjoyed tormenting a vulnerable woman. The fact that you experienced the same torment doesn't make us even, it makes you educated. David left that night understanding for the first time what had really happened to his life.
But that knowledge brought him no peace, no closure, no ability to rebuild what had been destroyed. He was trapped forever in the perfect prison I'd built for him, a life where everyone believed he was mentally ill, where his claims of conspiracy sounded like madness, where the truth was too incredible to be believed. I had given him the one thing he'd never given me, a complete understanding of his own powerlessness.
The divorce was finalized on a cold February morning. David signed the papers without contest, accepting a settlement that left him with minimal assets and strict limitations on his contact with Emma. He looked older than his 38 years, gray-haired and hollow-eyed, a man who'd learned too late that there are some games you should never play unless you're prepared to lose everything. I returned to my position at Stanford 6 months after Emma's birth, where I was welcomed back with sympathy and support. My colleagues praised my strength in dealing with David's mental illness while raising an infant daughter alone. I was seen as a devoted wife who had stood by her husband during his breakdown, only to discover his infidelity and make the difficult decision to prioritize her child's well-being. The irony of my professional success wasn't lost on me. I had become famous for understanding the very tactics I had used to destroy my husband. I published a groundbreaking paper titled Intimate Partner Psychological Manipulation, Recognition, Documentation, and Recovery that drew from my personal experience with David's condition. The paper was hailed as a breakthrough in understanding domestic psychological abuse. I was invited to speak at conferences around the world, consulted on high-profile criminal cases involving manipulation and gaslighting, and wrote a best-selling book called The Mind Games: Recognizing and Surviving Psychological Abuse. Dr. Patricia Williams, my mentor, congratulated me on turning my personal trauma into professional triumph. "Elena, what you've accomplished is remarkable," she said over lunch one afternoon. "To survive what David put you through, and then use that experience to help other victims, that's the mark of true resilience. If only she knew how resilient I really was." My book tour took me to cities across the country, where I spoke to packed auditoriums about the warning signs of psychological manipulation. I described the systematic erosion of confidence, the deliberate creation of doubt, the isolation from support systems. I talked about the importance of documenting abuse and seeking professional help. The audiences were captivated by my story, the brilliant academic who had survived her husband's psychological torture and emerged stronger than ever. They didn't know they were listening to a masterclass in manipulation from someone who had perfected the art. The most important thing to understand, I would tell these audiences, is that psychological abusers often appear to be perfect partners. They're charming, intelligent, and highly skilled at presenting themselves as victims when their behavior is challenged. The questions from the audience were always similar. How had I survived? How had I recognized what was happening? What advice did I have for other victims? Trust your instincts, I would answer. Document everything, and remember that healing is possible, but justice sometimes requires patience and strategic thinking. During one particularly memorable speaking engagement in Chicago, a woman in the audience stood up during the Q&A session. "Dr. Vasquez, my husband has been doing some of the things you've described, but when I confront him, he makes me feel like I'm crazy, like I'm imagining things. How do I know if I'm really being manipulated or if I'm just being paranoid?" I looked at this woman, probably in her 30s, well-dressed, clearly intelligent, and saw myself 3 years earlier, confused, doubting herself, desperate for validation that her perceptions were real. "Trust yourself," I said firmly. "Abusers are experts at making their victims doubt their own reality. If you're questioning whether you're being manipulated, start documenting incidents, keep a journal, take screenshots, record conversations if legally permissible in your state. The pattern will become clear." After the event, the woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I've been feeling crazy for months, but hearing you speak tonight, I know I'm not imagining things." I gave her my card and the contact information for several support resources. As I watched her walk away, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. I genuinely wanted to help victims of psychological abuse. My research and advocacy work were making a real difference in people's lives. But I also knew that I was the perpetrator of one of the most sophisticated psychological manipulation campaigns in history. The cognitive dissonance was fascinating from a psychological perspective. Emma grew into a beautiful, intelligent child who showed no signs of the trauma that had surrounded her birth. She was curious, confident, and deeply loved by everyone in her life. My parents adored her. My colleagues at Stanford treated her like a mascot, and she had no memory of the chaos that had defined her first year. David saw her twice a week, always under court-ordered supervision. These visits were awkward and stilted, with David trying desperately to connect with a daughter who barely knew him. Emma was polite but distant, treating David more like a friendly stranger than a father. During one of these supervised visits, I observed David through the one-way window at the Family Services Center. He was on the floor with 3-year-old Emma, trying to help her build a tower with blocks. She was chattering happily about her day at preschool, her friends, her favorite books. "Daddy, Mommy is famous," Emma announced proudly. "She writes books and talks to people on TV about bad people." David's face crumpled slightly at this innocent revelation. His daughter knew her mother as a successful, accomplished woman who helped people, while she barely knew him at all. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," David said quietly. "Your mommy is very smart. She says I'm smart too," Emma continued. "She says I can be anything I want when I grow up." "What did you want to be when you grew up, Daddy?" David was quiet for a long moment. "I wanted to be a doctor who helped people with hurt brains." "Are you still a doctor?" Emma asked with the direct honesty of a child. "Not anymore," David admitted. "Daddy made some mistakes and now I have a different job." Watching this interaction, I felt something that might have been regret. Not for destroying David, he had deserved everything that happened to him, but for the collateral damage to Emma. She would grow up with only the vaguest memories of her father, never understanding why he wasn't more present in her life. But then I remembered the videos on David's laptop. I remembered his laughter as he shared my pain with his friends. I remembered the systematic cruelty he had inflicted on me while I was pregnant with his child. Emma was better off without that influence in her life. She was better off with one strong, stable parent than with two parents locked in a toxic relationship built on manipulation and lies. 5 years after the divorce, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Martin Reeves, the psychiatrist who had evaluated David. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me calling," he said. "I wanted to update you on David's progress and discuss some concerns about his ongoing treatment." "Of course," I replied, though I was curious about what David might have told his therapist. "David has made significant progress in managing his anxiety and paranoid thoughts," Dr. Reeves explained. "However, he continues to maintain that his breakdown was caused by deliberate sabotage rather than stress-related mental illness." "I see. He's become quite articulate about it, actually. He's developed a detailed theory about how someone with advanced psychological knowledge could have orchestrated the events that led to his career collapse. It's sophisticated enough to be plausible, but obviously we're treating it as a continuation of his paranoid ideation." I remained silent, letting Dr. Reeves continue. "The concerning part is that he's starting to focus specifically on you as the potential perpetrator. He claims that you had the means, motive, and opportunity to orchestrate his downfall, and that your subsequent professional success is suspicious." "That sounds like a significant regression," I said, injecting appropriate concern into my voice. "It could be, or it could be a sign that he's processing his guilt about the affair and projecting responsibility onto you rather than accepting it himself. Either way, I wanted you to be aware in case he attempts to contact you with these theories." "I appreciate the warning, Martin. Should I be concerned for my safety or Emma's?" "I don't believe so. David has never shown any inclination toward violence, and his theories are focused on exposing what he believes is the truth rather than seeking revenge. But I would recommend maintaining your current boundaries and documenting any contact attempts." After I hung up, I sat in my office thinking about David's progress. It was impressive, really, how close he'd come to understanding what had actually happened to him. If he'd been anyone other than a diagnosed psychiatric patient with a history of paranoid delusions, someone might have taken his theories seriously, but that was the beauty of perfect revenge. It created its own perfect defense. The more accurately David described what I had done to him, the crazier he sounded to everyone else. I never heard from David directly, but I occasionally received updates through mutual acquaintances. He had moved to Portland, where he worked as a high school science teacher. He lived quietly, alone, still seeing a therapist regularly, and taking medication for anxiety and depression. According to these reports, David had become something of a cautionary tale among his former colleagues. He was the brilliant surgeon who had suffered a complete psychological breakdown, lost everything, and never fully recovered. Medical students were sometimes told his story as an example of how stress and personal problems could destroy even the most promising careers. The irony was delicious. David's destruction had become a teaching tool, a way to warn other doctors about the importance of maintaining work-life balance and seeking help when needed. His suffering was being used to help others, which was more than he had ever done with mine. 10 years after our divorce, I was asked to give a keynote address at the American Psychological Association's annual conference. The topic was long-term recovery from intimate partner psychological abuse, and it represented the culmination of my professional transformation from victim to expert. The auditorium was packed with over 3,000 mental health professionals from around the world. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "I want to talk to you today about the extraordinary resilience of the human mind, and the importance of understanding that recovery from psychological abuse is not just about healing, it's about reclaiming power. I spoke for 45 minutes about the nature of psychological manipulation, the long-term effects of gaslighting, and the various pathways to recovery. I discussed the importance of documentation, professional support, and patient advocacy. I talked about the need for mental health professionals to understand the complexity of abusive relationships and the sophisticated tactics that abusers employ. But I also talked about something that wasn't commonly discussed in professional circles, the concept of justice. Recovery from psychological abuse often involves a desire for the perpetrator to understand the harm they've caused, I explained. Victims frequently express frustration that their abusers never truly comprehend the depth of damage they've inflicted. This desire for understanding, for acknowledgement, for justice, is a normal and healthy part of the healing process. I paused, looking out at the audience of therapists, researchers, and advocates. The challenge for mental health professionals is helping victims channel this desire for justice in constructive ways. Some victims become advocates, using their experiences to help others. Some pursue legal remedies. Others find peace through forgiveness and moving forward. I didn't mention the fourth option, the one I had chosen: perfect, methodical, scientifically precise revenge that gave the perpetrator exactly what they had given their victim. The key insight I want to leave you with today, I concluded, is that healing from psychological abuse is not about returning to who you were before. It's about becoming someone stronger, someone who understands the depths of human cruelty and has chosen to rise above it. It's about transforming victimhood into wisdom, pain into purpose, and trauma into triumph. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Afterward, dozens of colleagues approached me to discuss my presentation, share their own research, and ask for guidance on specific cases. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a leading researcher in trauma psychology, pulled me aside during the reception. "Elena, that was extraordinary," she said. "I've been working with abuse survivors for 20 years, and I've never heard someone articulate the justice component so clearly. Have you considered writing a follow-up book specifically about that aspect of recovery?" "I have, actually," I replied. "I think there's a lot more research needed on how victims process their desire for accountability and justice. I'd love to collaborate with you on that," Dr. Martinez said. "I have access to a large cohort of survivors who might be willing to participate in a longitudinal study." As I drove home from the conference that night, I thought about the strange trajectory my life had taken. I had become one of the world's leading experts on psychological manipulation and abuse recovery. My research had helped thousands of victims understand their experiences and find pathways to healing. My advocacy work had influenced policy changes and professional training standards. All of this good work had grown from the seeds of my own perfectly executed revenge. When I arrived home, Emma was waiting up for me, even though it was past her bedtime. She was now 13 years old, beautiful and brilliant, with her father's dark hair and my determination. "How was your speech, Mom?" she asked, curled up on the couch with a book. "It went well," I said, sitting down beside her. "What are you reading?" She held up a copy of The Psychology of Criminal Behavior, one of my old textbooks that she'd borrowed from my office. "I'm thinking about majoring in psychology when I go to college," she said. "I want to understand how people's minds work, like you do." I felt a complex mixture of pride and concern. Emma had grown up hearing about my work, understanding from an early age that some people used psychological tactics to hurt others. She was developing her own interest in understanding human behavior, but I worried about her motivations. "What specifically interests you about psychology?" I asked. "I like the idea of helping people who have been hurt," Emma said. "But I also think it would be useful to understand how bad people think, so you can protect yourself from them." She was so much like me at that age, curious, analytical, determined to understand the world around her, but she was also growing up with knowledge that I hadn't gained until much later in life. She understood, in an age-appropriate way, that her father had hurt me psychologically, and that this experience had shaped both my career and our family structure. "That's a good reason to study psychology," I agreed. "Understanding human behavior can definitely help you protect yourself and others." "Mom," Emma said, looking at me with the direct gaze she'd inherited from her father, "do you think Dad knows what he did wrong?" It was a question she'd asked variations of over the years, as she'd grown old enough to understand more about our family's history. I'd always tried to give her honest but age-appropriate answers. "I think your father understands that his choices hurt our family," I said carefully. "Whether he fully understands the extent of that hurt is harder to say." "Do you think people can really change?" she asked. "Like if someone does something really bad, can they become a good person later?"
I considered her question seriously. It was one of the fundamental questions in criminal psychology, and one that I'd been grappling with professionally for years. Some people can change, I said finally, but real change requires not just understanding what you did wrong, but understanding why you did it, and making a genuine commitment to becoming different. It's rare, but it does happen. What about people who hurt others on purpose? Like people who enjoy causing pain? Emma's question was more sophisticated than most adults would ask, but she'd grown up in a household where these concepts were discussed regularly. Those people are much less likely to change, I admitted, because the problem isn't just their actions, it's their fundamental lack of empathy for others. Emma nodded thoughtfully. That's what I want to study. I want to understand why some people enjoy hurting others, and how to stop them. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, I reflected on the legacy I was creating. My daughter was growing up with a deep understanding of psychological manipulation and a strong sense of justice. She was learning to be analytical, strategic, and protective of herself and others. In many ways, she was becoming a better version of me, someone with all my analytical skills but without the damage that had driven me to seek such elaborate revenge. The next morning, I received an unexpected email that brought my past rushing back into the present. It was from Dr. Patricia Williams, my old mentor, with the subject line, "Difficult news." Elena, the email read, "I wanted you to hear this from me before you saw it in the news. David Harrison died yesterday in Portland. Apparent suicide. I know your relationship with him was complicated, especially after his breakdown, but I thought you should know. The funeral is Thursday if you want to pay your respects." I stared at the email for a long time, feeling absolutely nothing. David was dead, the man who had psychologically tortured me for months, who had shared videos of my suffering with his friends for entertainment, who had tried to systematically destroy my confidence and sanity while I was pregnant with his child, was gone. I waited for some emotion to surface: sadness, relief, regret, satisfaction, but there was nothing. David's death was simply a fact, like a weather report or a stock price. It changed nothing about what he had done to me or what I had done to him in return. I did not attend the funeral. I did not send flowers or a sympathy card to his family. I did not tell Emma about her father's death until several weeks later, when I felt she was emotionally prepared to process the information. "Mom," Emma said when I told her, "are you sad that Dad died?" "I'm sad that he never found peace," I said honestly, "and I'm sad that you'll never have the chance to know him as an adult, when you might have been able to understand him better. Do you think he killed himself because of what he did to you?" Emma's directness still sometimes startled me, but I'd learned to match her honesty with my own. "I think he killed himself because he couldn't live with who he had become," I said. "People who do terrible things to others often end up hating themselves. That's not my fault or yours. It's the natural consequence of his choices." "Is it wrong that I don't feel sad?" Emma asked. "No," I said firmly. "You barely knew him, and what you did know wasn't particularly lovable. You don't owe anyone grief that you don't genuinely feel." That night, alone in my office, I finally allowed myself to reflect on David's death and what it meant for my story. He had lived for 12 years after I'd revealed the truth about my revenge. 12 years of knowing exactly how he'd been manipulated, exactly how his life had been destroyed, exactly how perfectly he'd been outmaneuvered by the woman he'd underestimated. I wondered if he'd ever told anyone the truth. Probably not. Who would have believed him? A diagnosed psychiatric patient claiming that his ex-wife had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to destroy his life. Even if someone had believed him, what could they have done about it? The statute of limitations on any potential crimes had long since expired, and I'd been careful to never do anything that would actually qualify as illegal. David had spent more than a decade trapped in the perfect prison I'd built for him, a life where everyone believed he was mentally ill, where his claims of conspiracy sounded like madness, where the truth was too outrageous to be credible. In the end, that prison had become unbearable. I felt no guilt about David's suicide. He had made his choice, just as I had made mine. The difference was that my choice had been a response to his cruelty, while his cruelty had been unprovoked and driven by entertainment. David had taught me that some people enjoy inflicting psychological pain on others. I had taught him that sometimes the victim fights back. The lesson was complete.
20 years have passed since I first discovered David's affair. Emma is now 33 years old, a successful criminal psychologist in her own right, working for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. She never married David's replacement, the careful, kind man I eventually found when Emma was 10 years old, but she kept my name and carried forward the legacy I'd built. Emma doesn't know the full truth about what I did to her father. She knows he was psychologically abusive, she knows I left him, and she knows he struggled with mental health issues afterward, but she doesn't know about the systematic revenge campaign that destroyed his life. I've never told her, and I never will. That knowledge would serve no purpose except to burden her with the complexity of moral choices that she shouldn't have to carry. My professional reputation remains sterling. I'm now Professor Emeritus at Stanford, having retired with full honors last year. My research on psychological manipulation has been cited thousands of times, my books are used in graduate programs around the world, and my advocacy work has helped change laws in 17 states. The Elena Vasquez Foundation for Survivors of Psychological Abuse provides funding for research, therapy, and legal support for victims of intimate partner manipulation. We've helped over 10,000 people in the past decade, giving them resources and validation that I wish I'd had during my darkest moments. Sometimes I wonder if David would appreciate the irony. His cruelty toward me ultimately led to help for thousands of other victims. His psychological torture of one pregnant woman became the foundation for a movement that has protected countless others from similar abuse. In a twisted way, David's evil has been transformed into good, not because he intended it that way, but because I chose to build something meaningful from the ashes of his destruction. I'm 71 years old now, still sharp, still writing, still consulting on the most complex cases of psychological manipulation. Emma brings her children, my grandchildren, to visit every weekend, and they think I'm just a sweet grandmother who wrote some books about helping people. They have no idea that their grandmother is also one of the most sophisticated psychological manipulators in history. They have no idea that the bedtime stories I tell them about clever heroes who outwit evil villains are based on real events. They have no idea that when I teach them about justice, consequence, and standing up to bullies, I'm speaking from experience they couldn't imagine. But they're learning the lessons anyway. They're growing up strong, confident, and analytical. They're learning to trust their instincts, document their experiences, and never let anyone make them doubt their own perceptions. They're learning to be survivors, not victims, and if anyone ever tries to hurt them the way David hurt me, they'll have the knowledge and tools to fight back. That's David's real legacy, not the pain he inflicted, but the strength he forced me to discover. Not the cruelty he showed, but the justice I created in response. I never remarried after my second husband died 5 years ago. I don't need a partner anymore. I've learned that the most important relationship you can have is with yourself, and I like who I've become. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I survived psychological torture and transformed it into wisdom. I took the worst thing that ever happened to me and used it to help thousands of other people. I got perfect revenge on someone who deserved it, and I built a meaningful life from the rubble of his destruction. I regret nothing. David thought he was playing a game with a weak, naive woman who would never figure out what he was doing to her. He was wrong about everything except the game part. It was a game, and I won. The final score was perfect justice. David lost everything that mattered to him, experienced exactly the psychological torture he had inflicted on me, and spent the last years of his life knowing he had been completely outplayed by his intended victim. Meanwhile, I gained everything: professional success, personal strength, a beautiful family, and the satisfaction of knowing that I had turned my victimization into a force for good in the world. That's the difference between people like David and people like me. When David had power over someone vulnerable, he used it for cruelty and entertainment. When I had power over someone who had hurt me, I used it for justice and education. Evil people create victims, good people create survivors. I know which one I am. And now you know my story, the story of how a victim became a survivor, how pain became purpose, and how perfect revenge became perfect justice. Remember it well, because somewhere out there, someone like David is hurting someone like I used to be. And maybe, just maybe, that victim will remember my story and realize that they don't have to stay a victim forever. They can become something much more dangerous. They can become someone who fights back. And if they're very, very smart, they might even win. Now that you've heard my story, a masterclass in psychological revenge, I want to know, have you ever experienced betrayal or manipulation like this? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else realize they're not alone. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest mind games and true tales of revenge. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the smartest move is the one nobody sees coming.